lot of the things that Britain needs to survive, it has to bring in. And it brings it in by ships, largely from the United States, from South America, along well-traveled and long-established shipping lanes. Britain doesn't get what it needs from those ships. The British are going to starve. And so the Germans could cut them off from the outside world with submarines. They could force the British to leave the war.
This is Plausibly Live.
Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever you do. A lot of things happening in the world today, most of them far beyond our control, you might say. So perhaps it's time we took a pause and thought about life and thought about the laws of gravity, unrestricted submarine warfare, the Emperor's new clothes, Steph Curry, politics, and or the news. Don't touch the dial. Just try to hear me out for a little while. Dear God, it's finally February. Is anybody else in the same boat? I just felt like January lasted forever. But now it's over, and we can start the Valentine's Day thing. President's Day. Yay, February. In 1917, January, in fact, this was on the list of potential topics for Dave Does History yesterday. The Germans, the Imperial German government, made a decision that still reverberates to this day. The decision was to reinitiate the doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, in the early part of World War I, the Germans had conducted this, which was this idea that under international law, submarines had to surface, signal a ship, make it stop, board it, search it, whatever, and allow all the passengers to get off before they could torpedo the ship. The Germans said, that's stupid. That's getting our submarines killed. So we're just going to attack without warning. This is known as unrestricted submarine warfare, or probably more correctly as the correct way to do it. Many have argued that this policy is ultimately what will draw the United States into World War I. Through 1915, the Germans conducted this, and it was fairly successful. It wasn't brilliantly successful, but it was working. And then came along the SS Lusitania. The Lusitania gets hit by the U-boat, sinks, heavy loss of life, including 128 Americans. And many have argued that it's this unrestricted warfare idea that is going to lead to problems for the Germans versus the United States. After the sinking of the Lusitania, the Germans stopped that policy. They no longer would just attack ships. It's in 1917, like I said, January of 1917, that the German government realizes that they have to win this war, and they're losing, and they've got to do something. And so they reinitiate that policy. And again, as I said, many people have argued that reinitiation of it in January of 1917 is what will lead to the United States entering the war in April. I don't completely agree with that. It's a convenient explanation. Oh, the Germans have reinitiated unrestricted submarine warfare. We should go to war. There were bigger issues that are being ignored and that had much greater impact, primarily financial. My belief, and many people believe, that the United States entered the First World War for financial reasons. We don't have time to get into all that today, but this unrestricted warfare element of it, that said, was a factor. It was, you go look at newspapers of that day, you talk to the historians of that day, and it's this unrestricted submarine warfare that caused such terror that most people assumed that it was. Now, again, go back to the reason that it stopped, the policy stopped in the first place in 1915, was the sinking of the Lusitania and others, but the Lusitania was the biggest part of that. The problem was the U-boat had sunk the Lusitania because it was in an exclusion zone. And the German government had run newspaper articles in New York City before the Lusitania sailed saying this ship is, in danger. If you value your life, don't get on it. We reserve the right to sink her once she enters the combat theater. The British argument was that she was a civilian ship, and therefore any attack on her would be, a gross violation of all kinds of laws and morals and those sorts of issues that tend to go out the window during wartime. To the very end, the British have always refused to acknowledge that the Lusitania was carrying any kind of military cargo. Any type of military cargo on the ship would have made her a legitimate target. And they have always said, no, 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 no. Of course, later on, when Bob Ballard was exploring the ship, and the sunken Lusitania, lo and behold, we discovered that, in fact, she was carrying military cargo. And, in fact, the Germans were correct, and that their sinking of her, at least in the broader context, was actually legal. But in 1915, 1917, no one knew that for sure. This has raised a specter of World War I in our world today. Right now, there is a big ship called the Ark Integrity, which is getting ready to or has already sailed, I'm not clear, that is carrying 60 Bradley fighting vehicles from the United States, a neutral country. Eventually, those devices, those armored fighting vehicles, will end up in Ukraine. They are, in fact, a war cargo being carried for Ukraine. There are some who are speculating now. I don't agree with this speculation, but there are some who are speculating now that the ship could be legally attacked by Russian submarines. The problem with legality in war is that there isn't any. I know we have the Geneva Convention and all these rules and stuff that we're supposed to follow, but the reality is once the bullets start flying, all the rules go out the window. The problem that the Russians have here, I guess it's a bigger issue, isn't whether or not they can attack the ship, it's whether or not they actually could attack her. If there is any suspicion that they would attack the ship, then the United States is right back where it was in 1915 to 1917. You could, in theory, and again, this is aluminum hat theory territory. This is not happening. I don't believe this. But there are those who might be thinking in terms of it's 60 Bradley fighting vehicles. It's nothing, super important or anything like that. There's no troops on it or anything like that. If the Russians sink her, what happens in the world press? Just like what happened in 1915 and later in 1916. The Russians would lose the high ground. They would lose the moral high ground. Sure, they would claim the ship is carrying munitions, just like the Germans did with the Lusitania. And it fell on deaf ears. It would fall on deaf ears. Nobody would care. It would just be the Russians attacked an American-flagged ship sailing to Europe. And it would become an international incident. It would lead to tensions. And if the pattern follows, it would lead to, it should lead to the president standing in front of Congress asking for a declaration of war. It won't, because we don't do it that way anymore, which pisses me off. Or, conversely, if you thought that there was any possibility of this ship being attacked, you could guard her. In other words, form a task force of American ships to sail around her. Or even better, put a couple or three Virginia-class submarines in the area, or Los Angeles-class submarines in the area, and just sort of keep an eye on things. Now that raises more specters about, can we shoot? Can we, what do we do? And boy, now you're into gambling games here. Where are we going from this? For the Russians, it's a no-win scenario. It really is. Just like Germany in 1916 and 1917, either the ship gets attacked, probably not, in which case Russia, like Germany, loses the moral high ground, or the Bradleys end up fighting in Ukraine. And it could be, I'd like to be a fly on the wall, it could be that the Russians are facing a very similar strategic scenario to that faced by the Germans in 1917, where things are not going the way they want them to go in the war. They need to change directions. They need to get things going. But at the same time, can we? And if we do, what then? In 1917, it was incomprehensible to the governments of all of the belligerents. Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, France, England, Japan. The United States wasn't in yet, but it was incomprehensible to any of those governments that they could lose. And since they didn't think in terms of we could lose this war, they didn't try to scenario rosily ways that would lessen that impact. And I kind of see that same situation here. Russia doesn't believe that it can lose this war. I believe they could lose this war. I've said, I'm on record saying they're going to win, but, as George Patton said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Things can change. Things can differ. If it was just Russia versus Ukraine, I know where my money would be. But this scenario is very World War I-ish, which is eerily weird to me. And as the Milsurp writer and I often talk about, this whole thing in Europe right now is very 1913, 14, 1918-esque. It's very unstable, and it's very scary. And people are making decisions not based on logical outcomes. They're making decisions based on what's best for us right now, because we think this will help us win. Didn't work out very well in 1917, which of course then didn't work out very well in 1945. My suspicion is, even though you're facing the same strategic situation, it may not work out as well. It may work out exactly the same way it did before, but we'll have to wait and see. Either way, it is a very dangerous time, my friends.
I'm Bill Mick with WMMB Radio in Melbourne, Florida, where we have a governor that will actually stand for what's right. My show airs mornings from 6 to 9 Eastern. Every day we discuss news, politics, and social issues that impact us all. Tuesdays in our 8 o'clock hour, Dave joins me for something we call Dave Does History, where Dave brings us events from our past that contain lessons for right now. To listen live, find WMMB on the iHeartRadio app.
Hi, this is Justine, bringing you late night talk for those that go to bed early. Listen to my podcast, What's Justine Thinking, every Wednesday and Friday on Anchor and Spotify.
Many, many years ago, there was an emperor who was exceedingly fond of new clothes. So proud of them, in fact, that he spent all of his money on being very well dressed. He didn't care about reviewing his soldiers, going to the theater, going for rides in his carriage, except to do those things to show off new clothes. He was, we are told, have a coat for every hour of the day, a new coat. And instead of saying, as one might say about any other ruler, the king is in council, they always said, the emperor is in his dressing room. Now, every day, strangers came to the town, and among them came a couple of people who let it be known that they were weavers by their trade, and they said they could weave the most magnificent fabrics. Not only were the colors and patterns uncommonly fine, but the clothes that they made of this cloth had a wonderful way of becoming invisible to anyone who was unfit for office or who was stupid. Those would be the clothes for me, thought the emperor. If I wore them, I would be able to discover which men in my empire are unfit for their posts. And I could tell wise people from fools. Yes, I must get some of the stuff woven for me right away. And he paid the two men a huge sum of money, and they started to weave, or at least pretend to. All the finest silk and the purest old thread which they demanded went into their traveling bags. They worked the empty looms far into the night. One day the emperor thought, I'd like to know how these weavers are getting on with the cloth, he thought, but he felt slightly uncomfortable when he remembered that those who were unfit for their position would be not able to see the fabric. He might have doubted himself, but he thought he'd rather send someone else to see how things are going, since the whole town knew about it, and all were impatient to find out how stupid their neighbors were because they would be able to see it. I'll send my honest old minister to the weavers, he said. He'll be the best one to tell me how the material looks. For this is a sensible man, does his duty. So the honest man went to the room where the two men were working away. Heaven help me, he said. His eyes flew wide open. I can't see anything at all. But he didn't say anything. The two men begged him to be so kind as to come near and approve the excellent pattern, the beautiful colors. They pointed to the empty looms, and the poor old minister stared as hard as he could. Couldn't see anything, because there was nothing to see. Heaven have mercy, he thought. Can it be that I'm the fool? I'd never have guessed it, and no soul must know that I'm not fit to be a minister. It would never do to let on that I can't see the cloth. Don't hesitate to tell us what you think, said one of the weavers. Oh, it's beautiful. It's enchanting, he said, peering through his glasses. Such a pattern. What colors? I will be sure to tell the emperor how delighted I am with it. We're pleased to hear that, the swindlers said. They proceeded to name all the colors and to explain the intricate pattern. The old man paid very close attention to them so that he could repeat it back to the emperor, and so he did. At that point, the swindlers asked for more money, more silk, more gold thread to get on with the weaving, but it all went into their pockets. Not a thread went into the looms. The emperor presently sent another trustworthy official to see how the work was progressing. Same thing happened to him that had happened to the minister. He looked and looked, but there was nothing to see. Isn't it a beautiful piece of good, the swindlers asked him. They displayed and described their imaginary pattern. I know I'm not stupid, the man thought, so it must be that I'm unworthy of my office. That's strange. I can't let anybody find out. So he praised the material that he never saw. He declared he was delighted with the beautiful colors and the exquisite pattern, and to the emperor he said, it held me spellbound. All the town was talking about this splendid cloth, and the emperor wanted to see him himself while it was still in the looms. So with a band of chosen men, among whom were two of his trusted officials, the ones who had been to the weavers, he set out to see the swindlers. He found them weaving with might, without a thread in their looms. Magnificent, said the two officials who had already been duped. Just look, your majesty, what colors, what design? They pointed to the looms, each supposing that everyone else could see it. What is this, thought the emperor? I can't see anything. This is terrible. Am I a fool? Am I unfit to be the emperor? What a thing to happen to me, of all people. Oh, it's very pretty, he said. It has my highest approval. And he nodded in approbation at the empty loom. Nothing could make him say that he didn't see anything. The whole retinue with him stared. One saw no more than another, but they all joined the emperor in proclaiming, it's very lovely. And they advised him to wear the clothes made of this cloth, especially for the great procession he was soon to lead. The emperor gave each of the swindlers a cross to wear in his buttonhole with the title, Sir Weaver. Before the procession, the swindlers sat up all night, burned more than 6 candles to show how busy they were finishing the emperor's new clothes. They pretended to take the cloth off the loom. They made cuts in the air with huge scissors, and at last they said, now the emperor's clothes are ready for him. The emperor came with himself and his noblest noblemen, and the swindlers each raised an arm as if they were holding something. They said, these are the trousers, here's the coat, this is the mantle. All of them are as light as a spider web. One would almost think he had nothing on. But that's what makes them so fine. Exactly, all the noblemen agreed, though they could see nothing, for there was nothing to see. If your imperial majesty will condescend to take your clothes off, we will help you on with your new ones, here in front of this long mirror, said the men. The emperor undressed, and the swindlers pretended to put his new clothes on him, one garment after another. They took him around the waist and seemed to be fastening something. That was his train as the emperor turned round and round before the looking glass. "How well your majesty's new clothes look. Aren't they becoming?" he heard on all sides. "The pattern so perfect, these colors so suitable. It is magnificent." Then the Minister of Public Processions announced, "Your Majesty's canopy is waiting outside." "Well, I suppose I'm ready," he said. Turned around for one look in the mirror. "It's a remarkable fit, isn't it?" The noblemen who were to carry his train stooped low and reached for the floor as if they were picking up the mantle. They pretended to lift it and hold it high. They could not admit that they didn't have anything to hold on to. So off went the emperor and his procession, and under his splendid canopy, everyone in the streets and the windows said, "Oh, how fine are the emperor's new clothes. Don't they fit him to perfection? And see that long train." Not a person would confess that they couldn't see anything, because if they did, they would be considered stupid. No costume the emperor had ever wore had ever been such a complete success. But a little child, looking at all this going on, said, "He hasn't got anything on. He's naked." His father immediately turned to everyone around him and said, Did you ever hear such innocent prattle?" One person said to another person, the whispering, "He hasn't got anything on." Child said, "He hasn't gotten anything on." The emperor shivered, for he was beginning to suspect that maybe the kid was right. But he thought, this has to go on. And so he walked even more proudly than ever, as his noblemen held high the train behind him. And it was at that moment when the boy began to point again and say, "He's not got anything on," that the entire crowd around him turned upon him and tore the poor boy limb from limb for daring to point out the obvious, which is probably the way that story ends these days.
So I'm a cat, and I just moved in with this new human, and she's got this little toy she's always playing with, all day long. Tap, 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 bloop, bloop. She can't put it down. There it is. Oh, and get this. She even talks to it. Last week, she asked it for Chinese, and guess what? Egg rolls showed up. Like magic. Humans have cool toys.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
Now, why did I tell you the story of the Emperor's New Clothes? You probably know the story, but I like the new modern ending where a child who dares speak the truth, people don't wake up and realize, oh my God, the kid's right. They instead turn on the kid and they cancel him, tearing him limb from limb for daring to speak about things that, shouldn't be spoken about. If that's not a metaphor for our world today, I don't know what is. Speaking the truth these days, even simple truth, seems to be it's the kind of thing that gets you canceled. Which is what's going to happen, I think, to a guy by the name of Steph Curry, who is a basketball player in Northern California, plays for the Golden State Warriors. Many consider him to be one of the best players in the league right now. He has a $30 million mansion in Atherton, California, which that town, Atherton, California, has decided to upzone a 1.5-acre lot so that the property owner can develop up to 16 three-story townhomes, which would then be turned into, quote-unquote, affordable housing. And as it turns out, one of the people who was most adamantly against this concept of this affordable housing is Steph Curry. The townhomes that would be built would be, quote, looming directly behind us, said Curry. We hesitate to add the, quote, not in our backyard, literally rhetoric, unquote. But we wanted to send a note before today's meeting saying safety and privacy for us and our kids continues to be a top priority and one of the biggest reasons we chose Atherton as home. They stated in their letter that if the project moves forward, they will ask the town to pay for a bigger fence and landscaping to block sight lines to their property. Atherton, by the way, was ranked as the most expensive zip code in the United States a year ago. Land being worth about $8 million per acre. Atherton voted on the final plan yesterday, and it's a safe bet that it will not be passed. I haven't seen the news yet this morning because I just got up, so I don't know if it did or not, but, at the end of the day, who are you going to listen to? Poor people who want housing, politicians who say the reason that we have a housing crisis is we don't build enough housing, we don't have enough housing for people to live in, we don't have enough affordable housing. Or your superstar basketball player who, doesn't want those people looking over his fence into his backyard. You know as well as I do where this is going. And you know as well as I do that if some little kid pointed out the fact that this is just pure, hypocrisy, NIMBYism, if this was that this is just pure nonsense, that we're just allowing the emperor to show off his new clothes again by not allowing us to see into his property. Oh, my God. Well, you know what's going to happen to those people, right? Do you think their ideas and the things that they say are going to be listened to? Or are they going to be, canceled for daring to tell the truth? Which is very simply this. If we say the problem is we're not building enough housing, and we say, we're going to build housing, but a basketball player says, "Nyet," who's going to win that fight? And the emperor will continue to walk down the street buck naked. People will think that they're stupid because they don't see the new clothes. Take the time right now. Tell the people that matter in your life you love them very much. You'd miss them if they weren't there. Don't pass up those opportunities. You don't want to have that regret. Plausibly Live, I'm Dave Bowman. We'll see you next time. The Dave Bowman Show.